Hello, everybody, and welcome to Unequal Podcast with Karen and Jen. This month, we are celebrating Women's History Month here in Canada. So Jen and I are putting together some outstanding information and programming for you on famous and not so famous women. The upcoming interview with Jen may well surprise you, because the person, Shane Waters, although not female, deserves the title as champion for women. He underscores the value of the lives of women, especially those that have been deemed by society to be worthless and unimportant. Shane has a podcast called Out of the Shadows, in which one of the series covers the redhead murders, among other really important cases. Shane is the driving force behind the recent discoveries and finding of those associated. 5 women were unnamed before he started investigating the case, and thanks to him, 2 more have been identified, and he won't stop until they're all found. Shane Waters is a man of peace. You can hear it in the way he speaks. He respects and values these women because he appreciates the dignity that these women deserve as human beings. Shane, in his podcast, Out of the Shadows, has in his own reverent way brought these women back to life. We chose to interview Shane Waters for Women's History Month because of his commitment to these women. So without further ado, here is the interview with a man that we both admire greatly, Shane Waters.
I'm here with Shane Waters of the Out of the Shadows podcast. Shane, welcome to Unequal. I am speaking to you today as a very strong ally of women. In light of all the noise from the recent Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, I wanted to speak with you because as part of your podcast, you've covered a particular series of crimes known as the redhead murders. And I believe these crimes had a profound effect on your life. Please start this conversation by telling us about these women that you call sisters, and how did this happen?
Sure. So I originally heard about these victims by a fellow podcaster, Justin Rimmel, from Mysterious Circumstances. And I was specifically looking for cases that involved a victim that didn't necessarily have a lot of coverage. Up until that point, I had always worked with family members of victims to kind of share their story and kind of give you an idea of the personality behind the person. When Justin told me about these victims, there were a huge question on how many could have been involved. They estimated it up to, I believe, 20-something. So immediately I looked into them. All of them had been Jane Does, except one. One of them was identified. So here I was with, I had a folder on my computer for each of the victims, and I remember looking up all the information I could. I also pulled archived newspapers, and with all the information on all of these women, I had enough for about a 6-minute episode, and that's all the women combined. And to be honest with you, that's when it kind of got emotional for me, because I couldn't imagine, these are all people. And although most didn't have a name, they still had a life and a story, and they still had people that cared about them and loved them. And just to know that all the women combined, I couldn't say more than 6 minutes about them, it kind of just got to me, and it kind of broke my heart. So at that stage, I didn't have a co-host. It was just myself, but I had worked alongside my friend, Gemma Hoskins, and many people will know her from Netflix's docuseries, The Keepers.
Yay, Gemma! Personal hero of mine.
I love Gemma.
Yeah,
now she's my co-host, but at the time she wasn't. And I went to her and I told her about my frustration, about there's nothing new on these women. There hadn't been anything released for almost 30 years. These were a series of women that were murdered between 1983 and 1985. And I just didn't know what to do from a podcasting standpoint. And Gemma told me something that has always stuck with me. She told me that if things look like there's a wall in front of me, just keep on keeping on. And that's what I
Mhm.
did. So because there wasn't enough information for me to put together one podcast episode on these victims, I
Mm.
decided to go to the location that each of these victims were found to find information. So instead of putting just one episode together, I created a series on these murders. I traveled to the location that all of them were found. Initially, I ruled out a lot of the victims. I was trying to look for similarities um, that would lead me to believe that there's a high likelihood of a serial killer being involved behind a certain set of victims.
Mhm.
So I narrowed it down to 6 victims in 4 states: West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And I am from northern Indiana, so of course it was a nice drive. It was a nice drive for me.
Put some
But
miles on that car, huh?
yes, yes. But I did visit all the locations, and it was a super powerful moment. Um, Early on, I mentioned looking into the newspaper articles, and I could just tell that the language that society was using more than 30 years ago to describe these women, I strongly believe that aided in them not being identified and the cases not being solved. For example, one of the newspapers covering the only Jane Doe that was identified, she became known as the West Memphis, Arkansas Jane Doe. A year
Mhm.
later, she was identified as Lisa Nichols. And in the newspaper archives, you can read the articles that were being released about her after she was found, after her identity was found. They would describe her because all of these women, it's believed, they could have been sex workers
Mhm.
um, at different truck stops. So when they found Lisa's identity, they were releasing information in the newspaper. And one of the articles interviewed the detective in charge of her murder case. I'm going to repeat that. This is the detective in charge of finding out who murdered this victim. He was quoted in the newspaper as saying that she had a record that stretched longer from the floor to the ceiling 2 times. And
Mm.
he also said that she had a drug problem worse than his car has a gasoline problem. And that
Wow.
honestly just floored me. Like, that has nothing to do with solving that case.
She's a victim,
There, yes,
a
exactly.
human victim.
And she was so young. Her estimated age at the time was in her early 20s before they even knew who she was.
Mm.
So I know one of the things that I touched on in the very first episode of my podcast, and I talk about this article that was written, but it amazed me because there's this link that I hope that listeners discover when they listen to the podcast, that I fear that sometimes people forget that we all have a past and that we can outgrow that past. There was one point in time in high school where I was homeless. I lived
Mm.
in a partial shed, and if I was judged based on that, and it just blows my mind. You know, if I was killed at that time, I'm sure I don't even know if it would have made the newspaper. Another homeless person is murdered, you know?
Absolutely.
So just to think that the way that the detective was talking wasn't treating her like a real person that deserved justice, I think that's why the public forgot about these women. In large, all of them had been forgotten about. When I was visiting the locations that each of these victims were found in, most of them did not know who I was talking about. Um,
Wow.
in Lisa Nichols' case, again, the only victim ever identified. This is a powerful thing. I ended up working alongside a high school class, and it was a high school sociology class out of Tennessee,
Mhm.
Elizabethton, and we together put together a press conference. We were releasing all the information that we had so far, including a 8-page profile of the killer. And when we were putting this together, we were contacting all of the detectives in all of the areas that these victims were found in. And for Lisa Nichols, West Memphis, Arkansas, we contacted the sheriff because we knew that that would fall into his jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
And the sheriff, when we got him on the phone finally, he explained that he had no idea who we were talking about.
Oh,
He had no victim that was ever found in that area that we are talking about around that time. So, here I am having all this information, and I had already been to where she was found. So we sent it all over to him. And a few days later, he calls us back and he's like, okay, so I was wrong. They misplaced her file because it hadn't been
wow.
worked for so long. So the entire agency that's responsible for finding out who murdered this victim, this woman, they didn't even know that they had her as a case. So that just goes to show that if you think that you should look into a murder case or a missing person case, if anyone ever tells you that you are just because you're not a detective, you're not an FBI agent, this isn't your job, you're only going to hurt. Point back to this instance with Lisa Nichols, because if we hadn't done what we did, no one would know to even look for who murdered her. And that's one of
Oh,
the really good
geez.
things about what we've done so far.
Wow, that is just flooring to me. But I believe you completely, because there is such a distancing from victims who aren't like us,
Right.
who don't pay taxes, or as if they are somehow less than we are. One of my favorite podcasts that addresses that particular issue is called the Less Dead podcast. And it's done by two women who talk about women or perhaps transgender folks or gay folks who are somehow less dead than pretty white women, pretty
Yep.
white folks that get the media attention.
Agreed. I agree with that. I've never heard of that podcast, but I will check it
It's
out now.
it's a great podcast. They really do a great job of raising awareness of particularly of women who are completely overlooked and unheard of, just because they're women of color, period. Or perhaps they may, be in a sex worker or a lifestyle that isn't mainstream.
Right. One of the other things that we found out about Lisa Nichols, when they rediscovered her file and started looking into her case again, they realized that she had a daughter that
Oh,
disappeared. Yeah, so because it hadn't been worked so long, I think that was just forgotten about. But she had a very young daughter at the time that she was murdered, and no one knows what happened to her. We've not been able to locate her. No one with her name currently around her age would, exist in the U.S., so we're not sure what happened or, anything like that. So it's been a very emotional journey, to be honest with you.
Oh, I can't imagine it not being. And, did you have any idea when you started? I mean, from everything I've heard about and from you, Shane, this has changed your life.
Yes. Early on, prior to me hitting the road to visit all the locations, one of my best friends, her name is Kim Morrow, she had a daughter that died very young. She was in high school a few years ago. And at the location where she died, the car that she was in was hit by a train. And at the location of the train tracks, there's a cross there. And whenever I see that cross, it reminds me that, someone's loved one died there and their loved ones won't forget about it. And so that led my brother and I to building and painting 6 wooden crosses, and we painted them red. And at the location where all of these women were disposed, and that's the exact word I will use because that's exactly what happened. At those locations, I put up those wooden crosses. And for anyone who could be listening who has never been on the side of an interstate or the side of a road hammering in a wooden cross, it's just something that is life-changing. There were trucks and cars all driving through, and it was a loud area. But every time the hammer hit that wood, it just was a loud noise. And it was an undescribable feeling, and it was very emotional. But that's how it came about to where I started referring to these women as my sisters. Up until that time, no one was speaking for them. No one was fighting for them. No one was making the public reminding anyone about who these women are. A lot of times, cold cases, unsolved cases don't get worked as they should because they don't have family members pushing them into the public's mind or the detectives. And I believe that's exactly what happened for these 6 women. They hadn't been worked. Their cases hadn't been worked for more than 30 years. And that's something that we did find out through this series, is that they were not being actively worked. No evidence was being re-examined. We now have the ability to use DNA that wasn't available back then. So, I'm very hopeful now. They are my 6 sisters. Recently, we did help in identifying 2 of our victims. Now, out of the 6, we only have 3 left to identify.
That's amazing, Shane.
Yeah, thank you. One of the victims,
and that's you. I mean, really. When you hear, you think one person can't make a difference. Look what you've done. I mean, that is earth-shaking.
Yeah, and it's still something that I try wrapping my head around because I just consider myself a podcaster. A lot of people, I will say maybe investigative podcaster, but at no point in time when I started this journey did I think that I would have a key role in helping identify victims. My goal was just to get people thinking about them and talking about them. And as I mentioned, they are my sisters. So I feel very strongly about them. And if someone says something that's not correct, I will defend them like they were my sister. One of the very first cross I put up was in Tennessee. The victim is known as the Campbell County victim. And after I created a podcast on that specific victim for the series, it started being shared. And some listeners linked up and saw, hey, this kind of sounds like this could be this victim of yours. There was a sister looking for her sister, and we got in contact with each other because of these episodes being pushed out. And I spoke to her on Facebook, and she showed me pictures of what her sister looked like. And I mentioned I'm from northern Indiana, and this victim was from Indianapolis.
Oh, wow.
Which I had nothing in me thought that any of these victims would be from my state. I spoke to her sister, and of course I sent in all the information to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation with this tip. And they compared fingerprints, and it was a match. And
oh my gosh.
Yes. I remember talking to her sister, Liza, on the phone. So now we know the Campbell County Jane Doe. Her name is Tina Farmer. And Tina has a sister named Liza, and that was the woman that I met with on Facebook. She called me after we got confirmation that this was her sister, and we spoke for a lengthy period of time, and we continue to speak about this. And one of the things that she told me, and what her daughter has shared with me as well, is how horrific it was to learn that their loved one was murdered. I think that when you have a loved one go missing for so long, I think you kind of have this feeling in the back of your head or in your heart to where you think, I bet that they're no longer with us. But until you have that official proof that something horrible happened to the person that you love, I think that you will always hold on to that hope, and rightfully
Absolutely.
so. One of the very first victims I worked with in the podcast told me that it was much easier to live in hope than with despair. So I get that. Um, Her family continue to thank me for helping give their sister back to them.
Mm.
And on Wednesday, I'm going to go meet with them for the first time. We're going to discuss their sister, and we're going to speak with one of the last persons that um, came in contact with her. And when I mentioned earlier, my brother and I made crosses. Well, we made an extra cross. We actually made 7, um, specifically because I didn't want to go to these locations and one of the crosses break.
Oh, sure.
I never had hammered a cross into the ground, especially a wooden one. So I didn't want to be out, several hundred miles away from home and be without a cross to put up. So I had an extra cross, and so on Wednesday of next week, when I meet with her sister, I'm going to give her that cross.
Mm.
Tina is still, her remains are still in Tennessee. They're going to be re-examining, so it's going to be a lengthy period of time before her family receives her remains to bury her. And until that time, they're going to continue to have problems with that closure. But I'm hoping that the cross will, kind of remind them that someone did care. And
Yes.
and I can't say enough. Yesterday, I spoke with Liza again, and she shared with me that she's so excited to meet me. And she said, "I feel like we've known each other for a long time." And I said, "Well, we do share a sister."
Oh, wow.
So
That is amazing. Shane, I don't know how aware you are of this, but I too had a sister who was murdered. What my brother and I, before he passed away, we often were so grateful that, my sister, we knew immediately, it wasn't, she didn't just disappear. And we can't, as horrible as it is to go through when what has happened to somebody you love, to not know is incomprehensible to us.
right.
I can't even begin to imagine that kind of suffering.
One of the things that I'm working on now, um, so this is going to get me fired up a little bit, and that's okay because,
Good. We
uh,
like fired up here on Unequal.
well, I think that these women are my sisters. We're not related by blood, but they are my sisters. So anytime I speak about them or I feel like someone has wronged them, I get very passionate about it. So with Tina's family would have known a lot sooner where their sister was had only Indiana utilized the NamUs database. So currently, only 4 states require NamUs, which is completely ridiculous in my mind.
4? Only 4?
Only 4 require
Oh,
NamUs to be used. And for those who aren't aware what NamUs is a federal database operated by the Department of Justice and the University of Texas, I believe. And they are a kind of an identifying base. So, for example, ideally, if you have someone that goes missing for more than 6 weeks, ideally, their missing person profile is uploaded into NamUs. And then on the other side of NamUs, there is unidentified remains. So if someone is found and they're not sure who it is, they would upload that person's profile into NamUs. And they can use fingerprints, DNA, photos, dental, anything. And because both of those profiles would be put into NamUs, they would come up with a match. So
sure.
immediately you would know, okay, Tina Farmer is in Tennessee, north of Knoxville. So Tennessee is one of the states that requires it to be used. So Tina Farmer's remains, her unidentified remains, have been in NamUs for several years now. Unfortunately, Indiana does not require it to be used. Currently, there is less than 5% of missing people that have been missing more than
Oh my
6 weeks
gosh.
in Indiana entered into that database. And that 5%, I believe, is a nice average for most states that do not require it to be used. So, because of this, there was a tragedy that happened. Not only did the family have to wait many years later for them to find their loved one, Tina Farmer had a daughter.
Mm.
She was very young. She was a baby when Tina disappeared. And her daughter died last year of cancer
Oh.
without ever knowing what happened to her mom. And something that Liza told me is that she always was fearful that her mom just left her, just abandoned her.
Mm.
And they would have had all this information had NamUs been used in Indiana. So that's something that I'm currently working on now. You know, I'm just one voice, but I'm going to use that voice for Indiana. I've already contacted every single lawmaker in Indiana, trying to get them to see the importance of NamUs to be required. The thing with NamUs is that it doesn't cost anything for us to use it. It's already being paid for.
That was
So,
going to be my next question.
yes. So there's no cost. There's no cost at all. So there's no reason for it not to be utilized. It's just frustrating to me, to be honest with you, because I have a feeling that the other victims we would know if all states would require it. I told you about how we identified Tina Farmer recently. The most is just a few weeks ago. Another one of our victims we helped identify. Her name is Espy. In the podcast, you hear from Espy's daughter, Elizabeth. People
Now
call her
this,
Red.
yeah, this the one that there was DNA on?
Yes, that was the
Okay.
one that we've been waiting for DNA results for almost a year. Um, I spoke to Elizabeth in the podcast. Her mom didn't know how to read or write. They were very poor family, and we believe that her mom got separated by her family. She had some. We believe maybe she had postpartum depression
Mm-hmm.
because she had just given birth to Elizabeth right before she disappeared. Um, she ends up in Kentucky and she gets picked up at a truck stop. And I spoke to an eyewitness that detectives forgot about. Yeah, until I spoke with him, and then I put him in contact with detectives. Um, when I spoke to him, he tells me exactly what he remembers seeing. He's a very credible witness. He managed a restaurant at the truck stop, and him and his waitresses remember seeing this victim being picked up by this trucker. And he tells me exactly what the trucker looked like, what type of truck he drove. All very important information that I wish detectives looked in further. Back in the day when this all originally happened, they did speak to him at one point, but they didn't follow it up. Um,
And
so,
do they have any? I mean, I understand that you can't really be adversarial with these guys when you want information from them. Did they have any rationale for why some of this stuff wasn't followed up on?
I don't think that they, of course, the guys who are all in charge of their case now aren't the original people.
Got it.
The ones in Kentucky for the Kentucky State Police who were in charge of ESPYs, out of all the detectives that I had spoken to or worked with, they were the most, I don't want to say, we'll say kind, most helpful. One of them was a podcast listener of mine that may have
Oh,
had something to do
wonderful.
with it. Yeah. So they were very young men. So I don't know that they were even alive at that point when she was found, but they were, I think, kind of equally frustrated by all of these women, by by what had been done so far. So I think that that is something that they did share. But of course, I don't see, I don't know how often you deal with detectives. Most of the time they will not, speak poorly or honestly about their previous counterparts whose cases
Sure.
they've taken over. So with Espy, I had already been in touch with Elizabeth, trying to, help identify her mom. I met with Elizabeth in the town that Espy was found in, and it was a very emotional time. When the DNA came back, we all knew it was going to be her, and of course it was.
Mm.
We learned that something similar that happened to Tina happened to Espy. When she disappeared, the family reported her missing, but the police didn't take it seriously because Espy had been arrested before for prostitution. So all these years passed, no one ever was looking for her
Oh,
with the detectives in charge of her case. No one ever entered her into any database, let alone NamUs. However, there was basically the only thing that you'll find in the police reports is the family. After years, they would continue coming back asking questions, but it was never being worked because they saw that she was arrested for prostitution, and I don't. It doesn't make sense to me. She just had a child. I don't. Anyway, um, I think that we can learn a lot from both SB and Tina. If their remains were entered into NamUs, they would have been identified much sooner. SB's remains were entered into NamUs because of these detectives with the Kentucky State Police. Although right now Kentucky does not require it, those detectives had entered her unidentified remains in. Unfortunately, I believe she was from North Carolina. They did not enter her information in. It's not required. So it never got linked up.
and
So unfortunately, go ahead.
so Shane, just a question about the NamUs database. This is something that is available only to law enforcement, right? So if my cousin Ruby, I don't have a cousin Ruby, but if my cousin Ruby were to go missing, this is not something I could just put her information in.
Correct. So NamUs is operated through the Department of Justice. Only detectives have the ability to enter or remove people. However, you can go there and search through unidentified people. So if your aunt disappeared, you can go onto NamUs's website and look through unidentified people who couldn't fit her description. If her missing person file for your aunt was entered, then you wouldn't have to do that. So you can access it. So if your aunt did disappear, you can go on there to ensure that she was entered. And if
Uh-huh.
she wasn't, you can start hounding the detectives
Cool.
to enter it. Um, but you don't have the ability to link DNA. You don't have the ability to add her. Only the detectives would have that ability to do that.
Oh, but I've got a great ability to bug somebody.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've been doing.
Yes. That is amazing. Amazing, Shane. So you have 3 named and 3 left. What's next?
Right now, I'm trying to do a lot of things actually. Um, right now, I'm trying to find out more about Tina because I haven't had a chance to talk to people who knew her, who last saw her, where she was. I now know she was last seen at a truck stop. Someone believed that she was with a trucker heading south. Um, these are all good information that I hope will lead me to know more. Now I know that the trucker who was responsible for killing these women came up as far as Indiana. That could also help us know more of his route. Um, Unfortunate thing is a lot of times I get contacted by listeners who give good suggestions. One of the suggestions that I always get is why don't I look and compare routes with where we know this man was traveling. Unfortunately, back in 83, they didn't have computers being used, so all that
Yes,
information would have been on paper. And there's always this weird thing how there's always a flood or a fire.
of course,
And
yes.
not only that, but something very interesting that the sociology students at the high school in Elizabethton found is and this is brilliant, they were trying to find out why these could have happened, why they could have started happening, like why 1983? Why is that important? Well, right before these murders started happening, there was a new law that was passed in the US that eased the restrictions and regulations on truckers. So at that time, many of these smaller companies were popping up and they started hiring truckers. So there was a large increase of truckers that were coming on the road at the time that these murders started
Ah,
happening. So what that tells us is that now he has an opportunity to kill. There's a large misconception, I think, that just because killings stop happening, that the person must have died.
yeah.
A lot of people believe that serial killers don't have the ability to stop. They have to keep going, and that's not true. Um, we can see that in, the Golden State Killer. He stopped, but
Yes.
we know that he was still alive. In many instances, for example, in ours, for the redheaded murders, we know or we believe that he started because he had the opportunity, and we think that he stopped because he no longer had the opportunity. So there could be a few reasons. Yes, he could have died. He could have become disabled. He could have gotten hurt somehow and no longer could manually strangle someone or carry them. Um, Manual strangulation takes a lot of energy, and so you have to be, you know, being able to do that. He also could have started having a second driver with him, and that would have not given him the opportunity.
Ah, that's
Um,
that's brilliant. I would have thought of the others. I would not have thought of that one.
yes, there was a certain period of time where truckers started having a second person so they could travel longer distances. Um, so that could have been a possibility. He could have gotten fired. They could have, he could have gotten transferred. Many things could have happened, but we believe that he no longer had the opportunity to kill. All of the victims were redheaded women. Not all of them were natural redheads. Some of them just had reddish hair, or their hair was dyed red. Um, Working with the students, we did have an FBI agent who works with the profiling sector of the FBI review the profiles that the students put together. It's 8 pages, and in it, we talk about how old he had to have been. We believe that he was a white male because at the time in 1983, if it was a female or an African American, that it would have brought more attention to him. And we don't believe that was the case because, in large, no one remembered seeing
Uh-huh.
anything except the one eyewitness who told us that he was a white male. Um, we also put together a that we believe that he was a trucker because of having the ability to travel to these truck stops. Also, the eyewitness saw a truck and described his truck in great detail. Um, Also, he was able to travel long distances with these women and pull off on the side of the road without bringing attention to himself. And truckers have that ability. Um, there was lots of things that we learned. We coined a name for him for the press conference because we wanted a name that would help describe the person who we believe is responsible, as well as give you an idea on the method of killing and the areas that he was killing. So we titled him as the Bible Belt Strangler because all of these women were killed within the Bible Belt. Also, an important
Lovely.
thing, yes, another reason for the name, the Bible Belt Strangler, is because we believe that this man was a Christian. We believe that for many reasons. One of the reasons is that none of these women were sexually assaulted. Um, he just killed them by manual strangulation, which, for anyone who doesn't know, that takes a long time. In the very first episode in the Redhead Murder series, I played music for that period of time that it takes for someone to manually strangle someone. It is a very lengthy process. 2 to 3 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, but it is when you're in that moment. And that's what I have my listeners hear, because I think it's important, because that tells me that this person had a hatred, that although he didn't know who these women are, he still had this hatred, this passion to kill them. We don't believe that any of them were sexually assaulted because of a possible religion of his. Maybe he felt like that was wrong. But for some reason, he felt like he may have been doing the world or the community a service by getting rid of these women who were trying to sell sex at truck stops.
So he was exterminating them.
Yes, yes, and in the 8-page profile, we also describe reasons for that, reasons why that could have happened. One of the things that sticks out in my mind, and this is pure speculation on just being having to deal with this for so long, but a possible scenario is maybe his mom could have been a prostitute. She could have had red hair, and these women reminded him of his mom.
Mm-hmm.
There could be a number of reasons. The very first victim was found in West Virginia, which is a little further than the Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas. She was also a little older, so it's possible that maybe he actually knew this victim.
Mm-hmm.
Just because she does, she is a little older than the other ones. Yeah, I think that describes all the reasons why we named him that.
That is just, I mean, it is so intense. And how has this, and you don't have to get into too much detail, but how has this affected your personal life? Do you have nightmares?
We all know that people can murder people. This combined with, my podcast has been around for 2.5 years. This was so emotional for me because I actually visited the location for all these women and talked to people. And that, I've become very close. So it feels like each of these victims are family that were murdered. And
Sure.
although, I wasn't alive when these women were killed, I was born in 89. The last one was killed in 85. But I still feel that they are my sisters. And it's been such an emotional journey, but I think that having the knowledge that the people can hurt each other like this. I've never had that firsthand experience, and I think that this might be a feeling that most victims' families feel.
Definitely.
There's no reason for why these women were murdered. They didn't do anything wrong. It wasn't self-defense. This person just went out and decided that they deserve to die. And I think the most heartbreaking thing for me and what keeps me up at night is I think that he believed that no one would care. And I know that's the thing because he didn't hide them. He just pulled over to the interstate and threw them out of the truck. So I think that he banked on the community wouldn't care, that no one would care about these women. And for more than 30 years, that was true. So that's something that does keep me up. It's heartbreaking, and one of the things that I've heard from a lot of listeners that I didn't expect, a lot of people have been reaching out to me and telling me that they too were in positions that these women were in. I've learned that it was super easy, especially 30 years ago, to get into prostitution. or being forced into prostitution. But it was hard to get out of it once you were in. And many of these women had pimps. We know that Tina Farmer, she was being forced into prostitution in a truck stop in southern Indiana by a pimp. They couldn't get out, and it's heartbreaking all around. There's, you know, there's I I'm a very positive person, but I think that sometimes when I look at this deeply, it kind of gets overwhelming at some points, just because
It,
I feel like not only were they victimized by their killer, but they were also not being treated correctly by their communities and their detectives. Um,
absolutely. They were less dead than other people. I love that expression.
yes, yes, less dead. Definitely, definitely. When I spoke to Liza, Tina's sister, yesterday, she also shared that the same thing that happened to Elizabeth's family happened to her family, where the detectives weren't looking into her missing person case because she had been arrested before on a prostitution charge. Mind you, she was being forced into it at a truck stop by a pimp. We know the pimp's name. His name was Richard. So the idea that these women had been let down, and I hope that one of the things that people take away from listening to the series is that these women could have been prostitutes, and that's okay if they were. Um, one of the one of the students in the sociology class, they all had to write a paper for the end of the class, for the end of the semester, and they all wrote about their experience with, working with myself and speaking out for these women. And this is a class that ranged from freshmen to juniors. And one of the youngest people in the class um, spoke about how he didn't realize that people were treated so different. And I think
Wow.
that's something that's very powerful. And I hope that that's something that is being changed. I hope that our mindset changes with that. I think it's also so interesting because you know, we all know that some professions are dangerous. For example, and not making light of it, if a police officer or a fighter dies while doing their job, they're heroes.
Yes.
But if a prostitute dies because she has no other option, or doesn't feel like she has an option, or doesn't have a family that can help her because she just needs money to survive, if someone kills her, why does she deserve it?
Exactly. She
You know?
doesn't. She
Exactly.
absolutely does not. And as you were saying earlier, we all have, or most of us anyway, have had periods of our lives that we would consider maybe the worst time of our lives. Who of us wants to be judged based on the worst moment of our lives? How
Exactly.
fair is that? No, I completely agree. These were women who were cared about, who had something to give the world. The one young mother who disappeared from her child's life completely. I mean, I can't even imagine what that must have been like.
Right.
I also remember that I actually worked with women coming out of prostitution many years ago, or at least trying to come out of prostitution. And this was a totally different world to my mother. And she said to me, she was very naive. She said, "Well, are they really pretty?" And I was completely floored by that question. Because no, Mom, they live on the streets. You know, prettier girls have better choices.
Right.
And I was just completely floored that she thought that I was talking about some high class call girl, versus a streetwalker.
Right.
And neither of them deserve the kind of violence that is actually inherent in sex work.
Right.
But I think that what you have done, Shane, for these families. I mean, this is going to sound kind of lame, but it's almost as if you are their champion. You are their knight in shining armor, bearing their standard and saying, you know what? Not on my watch. These women are not going to be forgotten on my watch. And I think that is completely amazing. Completely. Now, you're able to do all of this because you're independently wealthy, right?
I wish that was the case.
So you have a Patreon account that people can contribute to?
Yes.
Outstanding. And that is under Out of the Shadows, perhaps?
Yeah, it's patreon.com/theshadowspod.
Outstanding. So, okay, people, contribute to this. This is important work. And Shane drinks a lot of coffee, and we got to pay for it.
I will say also, so we completed the first series on these women. We paused for a little while, and there will be a second season coming up, and there's going to be some exciting things that are going to be happening that we can't quite share yet. But there is more happening within the world of these women.
Outstanding.
And I am so determined to get the other three identified. So the steps that we've taken, I believe, will bring them to being identified. I'm hoping that not only will these victims be identified, I'm hoping that people will start looking in their communities at Jane and John Does that have been unidentified for so long and start petitioning your local detectives to enter those people into NamUs, because they could have a loved one out there that's looking for them. Unfortunately, if I were killed in Indiana and carried across state lines to any state, if I wasn't entered into NamUs, they would unlikely find me. That's a huge tragedy, and that can be prevented. So if you're not one of those 4 states that require it, and even if you are, start petitioning that everyone is being entered into it. I have a strong theory that it should be every case every time, and I stick by that. And that's something that I've contacted my lawmakers for Indiana, and I'm starting with Indiana, but that's not going to be where I'm going to stop, because I have a feeling that my sisters are from other places, and
Sure.
that's going to be a big priority for me.
Now, Shane, what are the 4 states? Can you tell us which that have them, that have or that legislate that NamUs be used?
That's a good question. I know that Tennessee is one of them. Michigan is one, but that's the only 2 that I have memorized.
That's cool. That's cool. We
Yes.
will find out, and we will put that out, because the rest of us have a fight on our hands, and we need to
Yes.
stand solid with you with this.
Yes. And I mentioned that we took a small break with the series, but we will be coming back. But I did want to touch on just a minute, because I think this could be important for your podcast as well, to talk about this series that Gemma and I are working on now. About halfway through the Redhead Murders, Gemma Hoskins joined me, and I mentioned she's from The Keepers. And of course, in The Keepers, they discuss Sister Kathy's murder from Baltimore, and the cover-up of sexual abuse that were happening by priests to children, both men and women, young children. So I've been in contact with her prior to The Keepers coming out, because I put together a podcast on this happening. Now, while we're taking a break between recording and releasing episodes for the Redhead Murders, we've come back to Sister Kathy and the abuse. Since The Keepers aired more than a year ago, there's been a lot happening. A lot more survivors are coming forward telling their story, and we found out a lot more information that will be helpful for not only the case, but hopefully to survivors to come forward. Just a few months ago, there was a Pennsylvania grand jury. They released a report that said that there were 300 priests being accused of abusing more than 1,000 victims.
That
How
is
crazy is that? And
extremely so.
just 2 days ago, I mentioned I'm from Indiana. The Archdiocese of Indianapolis released 30 names of priests that are accused of abusing more than 100 children. Now, I want you to keep in mind, everyone listening, that that's only people who have come forward. I've dealt, and I have nothing. I'm not a Catholic. I don't mean to offend Catholic people. I don't, I am a Christian, but I don't mean to offend anyone. I'm just telling you what I know. The Archdiocese of Baltimore, we knew, covered up this abuse for so long, and we have proof of this. And they've admitted to it. They've admitted that their priests had been abusing children. Unfortunately, Baltimore, along with many of these other archdioceses in different states, chose to defend the men, the priests, instead of the children, the victims. So, for
Yes.
example, the main priest behind Sister Kathy's murder, who we believed, I don't know if any of you have not seen The Keepers, but basically, long story short, all these victims were being abused at this all-girls school, Father Maskell. He started abusing young boys at boys' schools. The church started getting people complaining that their boys were being molested and raped. So they started moving them. They would move him to a different school. Finally, so many complaints would come forward, they decide to move him to an all-girls Catholic school, thinking if we put him away from girls, he'll stop doing this. Well, that didn't happen. And many of these victims did try going to the Catholic Church and the higher ups in the school, but none of them would help them. And that is a huge tragedy that we hope that more people will come forward and that more of these grand juries will start happening. We want to continue the conversation and the atmosphere that it's okay to speak out. If something happened to you and you feel like it wasn't right, you should speak out and you should have a community behind you. And that's something that Gemma and I have been working with survivors to make sure that people know that information. At the beginning of each of our episodes now, we put out the phone number for RAIN, which is a network for survivors, or if you're being sexually abused, a contact that you can use to get help. We also put out the information for an organization that helps abusers, people who have been abused by priests. It's a horrible thing, and unfortunately, I think it's way beyond what our imagination had. Something that we'll be talking about in a future episode is how many people have come forward now with claims of sexual abuse by just Father Maskell. Just one person. And I think that when people hear that number in the series, they're going to be blown away. And it's such a sad thing that the Catholic Church in Baltimore helped to cover up what happened and to keep it hush. I mentioned Indianapolis. The Archdiocese of Indianapolis released the names of some of the priests that had been accused of these acts. One priest that they released his name abused more than 20 children. And in the language that they used, they were praising themselves for trying to be transparent. But then I started looking into it more and I realized that most of them had been reported many years ago, some of them 20 years ago. Many of those priests that they released the names for have died. So I don't see anyone being transparent.
Yeah,
It's
I think
unfortunate, the whole thing is unfortunate.
Ironically, Shane, the Bishop of Burlington, Vermont, where I live, is from Indianapolis. He was he was bishop there and then came here. And we've had some recent bubblings. I won't call it a scandal because it hasn't risen quite to that level yet. But he is also talking about transparency, and the only way that this will ever be solved is, they say transparency, but they're still protecting the perpetrators. And until that is complete, until the Catholic Church, and I have a hard time saying I'm a Catholic right now, but I'm a Catholic. Until the church is willing to stand naked and confess publicly their sins, I don't see much future for the church.
I agree. One of the things that's happening right now, in a few months, the Pope is having many of the hierarchies of the Catholic Church. I've never been a Catholic, so this has been a very big experience for me, learning about many of the practices for Catholics.
Oh, yeah.
I do have friends and family who are Catholics. I know that there are good people, so before anyone messages me telling me that I shouldn't hate the Catholic Church, I don't hate the Catholic Church.
And neither do I.
Yes, I hate that there are any time you have humans, there is the opportunity for mistakes to be made. I realize that. But these mistakes have affected so many lives. I mean, Pennsylvania alone, more than 1,000 people have come forward saying me too. So, as I was trying to say, the Catholic Church, the Pope has called for a closed door meeting to talk about the abuse and what they need to do about it, what they should do about it. But I think that the time for closed doors has passed. I would love for the Pope to open those doors to some of the victims, hearing their stories. And, most of the victims that we've spoken to for the podcast, we are doing a new series right now. We're, I think, 5 episodes out. It's called Sister Kathy on the podcast. Most of the victims don't hold anything over the Catholic Church. They realize that faith is important to people. They just want the abuse to stop. They don't want what happened to them to happen to their children or anyone else's children, because they know firsthand what it's done to their lives. And they're not out for money. They're not out for anything except for this to stop. And that's such an important message that I hope people will take away from this series. For those not familiar with the Keepers and Sister Kathy, we believe that she was murdered because she tried to stop this priest from abusing her students. And ultimately, she was murdered for it. And we strongly believe that. And throughout the series, not only the Keepers, but our podcast series, we continue the conversation and we continue to talk about the reasons why we believe it. It's such an eye-opening journey, especially to do this after I've been working on the redhead murders for so long. I have a new renowned passion for women who have been wronged, and that's something that with this new series, Gemma and I are tackling. I can't say enough about the redheads, my sisters, and I can't say enough about the victims that continue to come forward, who've been wronged horribly, and they tell their stories on our podcast, and it's so hard to hear, but it's important to talk about, and that's ultimately what our podcast is about.
Shane, one thing I will say that helped me a lot with dealing with with my disappointment in the Catholic Church is something that my husband, who is not a Catholic, pointed out to me. He said to me, he said, honey, your problem is not with God. It's with middle management. And that was like a light bulb going off in my head.
It's so true.
It's like, oh my God, that's completely right. It is, as you say, you get humans involved. It was, I mean, if you want to talk about the ultimate example of that is, the Garden of Eden was great until the humans showed up.
Right. Right. Well, one of my favorite quotes is something that Gandhi was asked. Someone asked him what he felt about Christians. And he said, Christians and Jesus, I'm sorry. And he responded and said that your Jesus I like, and he agreed with that, but your people are not like your Jesus.
That's right.
And it's true. When you add the human element, there's room for corruption. But I don't know. Yet just last night, we spoke to one of these women who had been abused for many years at the school. And just to hear their firsthand accounts of what happened to them, it's horrible. And I wanted to stop, and I'm not Catholic, but if I need to talk to the Pope, I'll give him a call. Someone gets me his phone number.
You know what? He's on Twitter.
Oh, is he?
He is.
Okay. Well, let's see if I can get him to meet me. I think that he should just meet with Gemma.
You might be surprised. This guy, you know what? This guy might.
Really?
This guy might. He is a different horse.
Okay.
One of my favorite things about stories I've heard about him was, they had after he was, installed as Pope, they had a big celebratory dinner with the bishops and cardinals and all. And Pope Francis offered a toast, and he said, "May God forgive you for what you have done," meaning to elect him.
Yeah.
Because he knew he was going to shake things up.
Well, that's what it needs. I mean,
yes, no argument at all. So we don't know. We might find ourselves on a plane to Rome.
I might write him a letter.
Do it. Seriously.
Okay, I will. This
has been a fabulous conversation, Shane. I think you and I would be and are actually friends. And I think we see a lot of the same things the same way. I completely support you in all of your initiatives, and you'll be hearing from us again. And I'm sure we'll be hearing from you and the lovely Gemma Hoskins.
Yes. Next time we'll have to include Gemma.
Oh, definitely.
She is brilliant.
Oh, and she is, well, my husband sometimes says I am like a pit bull, because if I get a scent of something and get my teeth on it, I don't give up. And that is exactly how I think of Gemma.
Yes.
She will not be put off the scent. So
no.
I can't thank you enough for talking with me today and for what you're doing for, Shane, they're not just your sisters, they're our sisters. And you've made them that. That's really a huge thing. That is a huge thing. And I'm so grateful. So I'm going to conclude this before I start to cry. So we'll be in touch. Okay. Thanks so much for making the time today.
Thank you.
That was an incredible interview. Thank you, Jen and Shane. And thank all of you for taking the time to listen. If you don't mind, maybe you can pop on by iTunes and leave us a review. That would help us tremendously. And also a big thanks to everybody that supports us on Patreon and contributes on our Unequal Facebook group and on our Unequal Twitter page @UnequalPod. That's where you can find us. So please, everybody out there, take care of yourself, respect yourself, love yourself, and try to love one another. Peace. One love.